on the back of this. Joydeep Hor is Managing Principal of specialist workplace law firm People and Culture Strategies and joins me now. Joydeep, good to have you on the show. Thank you. So, Qantas will get together with the unions tomorrow. Set the scene for us on the kinds of discussion that they will be having.
So Qantas is party to a number of enterprise agreements. Those agreements will be with a number of different unions. I think some of them have been interviewed and spoken on this channel earlier today. The critical issue that will have to be discharged from a Qantas point of view tomorrow is their obligation to consult, because most of the agreements that they will have in place will impose an obligation on Qantas as an employer. And it's not an unusual clause, it's an obligation that's imposed on a range of employers who have these kinds of enterprise agreements, that if they have made a decision to introduce significant change, that they will have to consult with their employees, consult with those employee representatives, the unions, around what those changes are, why those changes have been taken, what alternatives have been considered prior to the introduction of that change, particularly if we're talking the kinds of redundancy numbers that have been raised today, exactly how that is going to be carried out, what steps they're going to put in place to transition people out of their workforce, redeployment if at all possible, if not internally, externally, and there's going to be lots of nuts and bolts. Now that would happen in the course of any major restructure or downsizing exercise. What makes this particularly interesting and challenging is that, as we've seen today, every man and their dog has a view about why this has happened and what could have been done differently, and no doubt the unions will express their views about what could have happened, should have happened, right, and perhaps what might have been the consequences if those things did happen.
So there's some kind of obligation to have a conversation, but there's no obligation on anyone to, and I'm thinking of the unions, to agree to anything.
Well, it depends precisely on the wording of those particular obligations in those agreements. Typically, they are written in such a way as to impose an obligation to consult. It's not often written to the point of you can only make those changes if there is agreement. But as we've seen and heard today, there are other ways that the unions might wish to flex their muscle if they are not happy with what's tabled to them tomorrow. Because
the company said today, wage freezes until we make a full year profit. That's right across the board. Can they just do that, and can that be an indefinite thing? I mean, we obviously don't know when they're going to make a full year profit, and some analysts are saying it's a while off. So
absolutely. So this will have differential impact across their agreement-covered employees, which will typically be the operational employees, and their management or salaried employees. So if those employees are purely employed under contract or a contract of employment, it's unlikely that they will have guaranteed wage increases written in or salary increases. So it's easier for Qantas to say in relation to management, yes, we're imposing this wage freeze or salary freeze. If they've got obligations, however, under their enterprise bargaining agreements or enterprise agreements that say year on year there'll be a 2% increase, 3% increase, well, that's a whole different ballgame. Now, they're not going to just unilaterally be able to say we are shying away from and now not going to honour our legal obligations under a contract, which is effectively what an enterprise agreement is. They're going to need to think about exactly how that can be affected. If the unions say no, then Qantas is going to need to think about what industrial strategy it has available to affect those changes.
Yeah, and so if they have talks tomorrow, what is the conversation that would go on that could prompt the strike action being called by the unions?
Well, I think in terms of whether that strike action is legal or not, it's likely that if there are current enterprise agreements on foot, then any strike action taken in respect to people covered by those agreements is likely to be illegal. So I would expect that Qantas will take action in relation to that, in terms of remedies in the Fair Work Commission and perhaps elsewhere. If, however,
so that's probably just posturing at the moment for the TW to say we're not ruling out strike action.
Yeah, it all depends on what status the agreements have and whether the people who are proposing to take that action are covered by valid agreements. So that's a technical point more so than anything else. The reality is that posturing is going to have a lot of people very nervous. The noise about industrial action hits Qantas the hardest in terms of its customer base and people who've got travel plans, no doubt, in upcoming days and upcoming weeks. And no doubt that is part of the industrial response strategy from the unions in this game.
But we know that Qantas doesn't lie down easily on that issue, and in fact it was on the side of the law when it grounded the planes a few years ago.
Indeed. So Alan Joyce took decisive action in relation to the grounding of that fleet, and there will be similar remedies and recourse available to him. He's perhaps got a slightly more sympathetic government at this point in time than he did then. So all of that will be very interesting.
There's also, I suppose, a question from some about how the company has managed the redundancies through the use of the media. We've been hearing these reports of 5,000 jobs for days now. So, I mean, it obviously came from Qantas. Do you think that is damaging to that relationship between the Qantas and its unions or the workforce? Is it the way you've got to do it these days? I mean, how would you judge that as someone that's kind of looking at it from the inside of business as well?
Absolutely. It's never a good news story to be telling anyone, and most particularly the people who are going to be affected by that news, that you are putting them out of a job, particularly in a market that is not a buoyant employment market. For any business to let go of 1/6 of its workforce, whether you employ 20 people or 20,000 people, it's a very significant decision to make, and I'm sure it's not a decision that's been taken lightly. As to what is the best way to communicate, it's never easy, but one thing that we would always say to our clients is that the more information that you share with your employees around how your business is going, the more that you are transparent in relation to the factors that are going to influence the making of this kind of a decision, even if that decision hasn't actually been made now. But if you were to say, well, look, if this trend continues, then we may need to be making some redundancies, and if the numbers are going to be like this, then these are the kinds of numbers that could be exited from our business. Now, again, it's never an easy message to sell to anyone, because no one's likely to respond to that in a buoyant and jubilant way. So in some ways, there is no easy way or proper way to let people know. I think at this point, though, the news having been communicated around the numbers, the challenge for Qantas as a massive and iconic Australian employer is how it now responds to the management of the individual careers of each of those 5,000 employees, whether they are treated with dignity and respect, the flavour that is left in their mouths as they exit that particular organisation. And just as importantly, let's bear in mind, while it's a significant number, there's still going to be 25-odd thousand people who will be there at least for some time. What is the culture that is going to be the residue post this kind of a change? Now,
what they do now can limit any kind of damage.
Absolutely, and if the people who are staying see that as difficult a decision as it was, those people were treated with dignity and respect, and sure, they're going to get significant redundancy packages in some instances, and we've seen the numbers around that, but the cultural piece just can't be underestimated, because the kind of change that needs to happen in this organisation at a commercial level, from everything that I've heard today, will only happen if they've got an engaged workforce that's working with them to make that change happen. And they're going to need to get some buy-in from the unions, because the last thing they want is to be making every hurdle an impossible one with their industrial relations.
Fascinating as always to speak to you. Thank you very much, Joydeep. Appreciate your expertise on that one. Yeah, so unions meeting with Qantas tomorrow. We have a quick break to take. When we come back, we'll hear what Rex, the regional airline operator, has to say about Qantas's news